Great. Welcome, everybody. My name's Steve Haines. I'm a biodynamic craniosacral therapist. I'm going to try and explore non-doing and how that fits in with the model of biodynamic craniosacral therapy. One of the things that cranial work is so attractive for me is that the less you do, the more seems to happen. And right in my very early days of studying, I studied Zen Shiatsu actually before I studied cranial work. And that was a whole new worldview, reading about Zen, learning about Zen. And I read some books that I want to celebrate with you. And one level, the structure of this course is the structure of books that are really, of this webinar, is talking about some books that have really influenced me. And partly why I came back to the idea of non-doing, I wanted to talk about it a little bit more, was Body College is a sort of new cranial school that's emerged from body intelligence. And I'm kind of rewriting the manual and trying to think more deeply about the core principles for me. And I realize I talk about non-doing, or I frame the work that I do as non-doing. Internally, I do that a lot, but I haven't actually written about it or thought deeply about it for a long time. But I have lots of sources that are deeply influential for me, I realized. So I'm going to try and talk about those a little bit. Some of the Zen and Taoist philosophy that really helped me follow this principle of less is more, and that we don't need to strive, and that we can achieve these incredible moments of synchronicity or permission or allowing where things change internally for a client. I think one of my strongest teachers absolutely was Franklyn Sills. And Franklyn, big brain Franklyn, incredibly warm heart as well. But he'd studied lots of things, but one of the things was he did a line-by-line translation in San Francisco, I believe, with a Chinese master of some sort of the Tao Te Ching. So this famous classic text. So we're going to reference that a little bit. But Franklyn really wove in Buddhism into his work, but also this notion of non-doing and effortless action. I'm going to look at then I read about 5-6 years ago, a couple of books. One of them has a terrible name, but it's a great book, The Rise of Superman, Stephen Kotler. And that was a more modern science and athletic performance take on flow states. And I thought it was incredibly rich. So they have some triggers for flow states, and they define flow states in ways that are really interesting. So I want to explore that a little bit as well. But there might be a critique of the flow state model in that it doesn't actually include, well, it's very focused on the individual and individual performance. And around that time, around reading the Stephen Kotler book, I read another book called Trying Not to Try by Edward Slingerhand. And this was a revisiting of Chinese philosophy, but still looking at this territory of flow states and referencing the science, but also adding in the old Chinese philosophies from the Warring States period, sort of 200 to 500 to 200 BC before Christ. So again, the huge development, I think, in Slingerhand's model and Trying Not to Try was this notion of virtue, and not just individual achievement, but ethical non-doing. The idea that we can live an ethical, moral life or be part of a community as a leader or as someone who is admired or trusted through this achievement of non-doing or alignment with inner nature somehow. So we'll have a few quotes from Edward Slingerhand on this notion of virtue, and maybe we might even explore virtue ethics. So it's not just about individual achievement, but about inspiring, being in a community with other people. And then finally, biodynamic craniosacral therapy. We're going to learn from osteopaths about some of the ways that they achieve what I think is very close to the idea of non-doing. And we're going to look at some key principles in biodynamic craniosacral therapy, states of balance, not least, finding the neutral, these technical terms that we use in biodynamic craniosacral therapy that for me are very much aligned with non-doing. So I hope it's fun, folks. There'll be a recording. The slides will be on the recording, so there's some references and things to look at afterwards. So here's a just basic outline of the talk. Non-doing in biodynamic craniosacral therapy. We'll do an intro to effortless action. We'll look at Taoism and Zen models. When I was reading my first entry into this world, Taoism was spelled with a T. It tends to have changed now. I don't quite understand why, but so you'll see me use T or a D in some of the slides. I'm using a T sometimes because the old books still use Taoism with a T. We'll look at flow states, this sort of more sciencey athletic performance model, and then we'll return to trying not to try from Edward Slingerhand. We'll look at osteopathy in the cranial field, and then biodynamic craniosacral therapy. I will keep an eye on the Q&A, and I'll pause every so often just to take a break and see where we're going. Well, first off, intro to effortless action. This is effortless action, quite an extraordinary video of an environment that for a human would be very low risk, but for this gibbon, I think it is. Just a sort of easy, effortless process. Not much thinking involved here, just learned motor patterns as the gibbon walks along the tightrope in this incredibly assured and confident way. Phenomenal video. So one of my disappointments this afternoon, if I saw a video of a woman in the Pakistan floods who was carrying things and she had to walk along a fence to get across the flood. Spent about an hour searching for it, to be honest. But it was the same effortless action. She was assured, confident, there was a high-risk environment, but she was incredibly confident and skilled in walking across this narrow fence that was sticking out of the water. So yeah, just incredible. But this isn't a thinking, mechanical, muscling it type of way. This involves harmony, balance, practice, and I'm going to offer something called deep embodiment. There's another example for nature of kind of non-thinking, effortless action. This is a bobcat, I think they're calling it, a mountain lion maybe. And just, here it is, it's off, boom, 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 fantastic. Just a body working and doing incredible things, a flow state, not thinking about the danger, but focused on what can be achieved. And this harmony of mind, body, focus to achieve something incredible. There's a little video on flow states, mostly through a dance model, but still very beautiful, and I hope gives you a sense of what we can achieve with practice. That's going to be one of the things that I want to emphasize on this course. Good, nice, I hope. I did a series of workshops with a dancer, Marina Collard, in 2015. And Marina's danced all her life. She's also a craniosacral therapist. And we tried to do a combination of movement, so a morning of movement and then an afternoon of treating. And that was a very inspiring set of workshops for me. I did sport, but dance and me aren't the best of friends, if I'm entirely honest. But bringing awareness and simplicity to simple gestures of standing, sitting, rolling, for Marina, those were endlessly rich exercises. Even just rolling over, we would spend an hour just rolling from lying on our back to our side to sitting, and then trying to go from sitting to standing. When Marina did it, it was like water being poured. It was just this elegant balance of releasing tension and counterbalancing and moving. When I did it, even after practicing, I did that workshop 4 times, maybe even 4 times with Marina, I could still never find the ability to go down into the floor without a collapse or without a contraction sometimes in my system. So yeah, dance, people can achieve this notion of effortless action, the ability to be in harmony where we're not muscling, we're not overthinking, but we enter into this flow state. Here's a definition of a flow state from Edward Slingerhand, based on Wu Wei or Wu Wei. My language skills are terrible, but I'm going to go for Wu Wei. Wu Wei literally translate as no trying or no doing, but is not all about dull inaction. In fact, it refers to the dynamic, effortless, and unself-conscious state of mind of a person who is optimally active and effective. So I love that, dynamic, effortless, unself-conscious. And it's something about achieving optimal functioning as a human being. So when we're in harmony, when we're in these flow states, we have amazing insights. Things change because there's an inherent letting go rather than a forcing from the outside. And there's a lot written about this in different traditions of Zen and Taoism. Those are the roots that I first discovered this model of non-doing. Let's keep going on the Taoism and the Zen model. So I really enjoyed preparing for this lecture. I had to dig out some of my old books. Some of them I unfortunately haven't opened for a long, long time. These are beautiful picture books of the Tao Te Ching and another sort of Taoist model, Chung Zi. Both really, really beautiful from the 1996 and really lovely translations. The translation of these things is like translating poetry. This brown book, Aldris and I can't remember the second author on it, again, is a quite famous translation, very elegant way of interpreting these texts. If you've never met Alan Watts, he was an extraordinary early Californian interpreter of the Tao. This is a really lovely book. One of the things that I got from that, and he famously described as Tao as the watercourse way. And also Bruce Lee talking about be like water. This idea of Bruce Lee as this incredible martial artist, but his skill wasn't resistance or wasn't muscle. It was being like water, flowing and turning, energy coming towards him and the ability to transform that and give it back. And then I still would make a strong claim that Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind is one of the best books on how to do cranial work ever, really. A very, very influential book from me. One version of Zen, Zen Buddhism, is a tradition of within the Buddhist canon. But Zen is also seen as Taoism meeting Buddhism in Japan. So Taoism was a Chinese philosophy, kind of seen as a counterbalance quite often to Confucianism, and this incredibly fertile period in sort of 300–400 BC, where actually the kind of the Buddha, Confucius, Lao Tzu, and also some of the Western Christian figures were sort of all around, and incredible flowering of human culture at this time. So yeah, I'd highly recommend any of these books, but for easy reads, Alan Watts, Tao, The Watercourse Way, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. My absolutely first entry into this, world was Zen in the Art of Archery. So I got this book when I was studying Shiatsu, Zen Shiatsu as it was. So the story is from the 1950s, a Westerner being embedded in Japan and learning how to do archery, but learning a whole way of being and learning how to let the arrow fire itself. And that's a famous phrase from that book. So the archer ceases to be conscious of himself as one who is engaged in hitting the bullseye, which confronts him. This state of unconscious is realized only when completely empty and rid of the self, he becomes one with the perfecting of his technical skill. So there's very rich, evocative language. There's a phase in the book where he's trying to learn this letting the arrow fire itself, of being balanced and struggling to pull the bow and not achieving any results if the results is the arrow hitting the center of the target. He has a break from his master of trying to do this ritual of pulling and effortless doing that the master is trying to teach him. And he goes away and learns some other skills about how to fire an arrow. He's thinking a bit more, planning a bit more, using some tricks. And he actually starts being more accurate with firing the arrow. And he comes back all pleased and happy with himself that he's doing this more technical way of achieving the goal of hitting the closer to the center of the target. And there's this incredible disappointment from his teacher. The teacher sort of bows and says, I can no longer be your teacher because I haven't taught you well enough because you're doing all these tricks that aren't the real essence of archery. They make up, and there's a famous scene where the guy does it in the dark, possibly, or just does this effortless. The master just fires repeatedly into the bullseye. It's not without its critics, this book, as a fantasy of what happens, and maybe Herrigel was a little free with his interpretations. But still, it's a beautiful model of trying too hard, going down blind alleys, but returning to this effortless action and this principle of trying to be in harmony with the bow, in harmony with the arrow, and letting the arrow fire itself as a gesture. Wow, wonderful stuff. And it really, really stayed with me as a model of working. Taoism, language and words. Here's something else. This is the opening statement of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. They're very hot on not using cognition as the primary tool. Somehow slow thinking, trying to use rationality, is not effective as this instinctual way. So words as a way of understanding, or language and cognition as the tool that we use, is sort of seen as distant from the Tao, the true way. This is from the, gosh, I wish I could say these words, Zhongzi, the Inner Chapters. It's a little riff on too many words. We are already one. What else is there to say? Yet I have just said that we are one, so my words exist also. The one and what I said about one make two, and two and one make three. Thus it goes on and on. Even a skilled mathematician cannot reach the end, much less an ordinary man. If we process from nothing to something, we reach three. How much further would it be going from something to something? Enough. Let us stop. This sort of exasperated quality at the end of this passage is very famous. Too much thinking, too many words. Words, cognition, overthinking aren't the way to align with naturalness of the way. They aren't the way to flow like water and achieve this place of effortless action. Here's Edward Slingerhand, this wonderful book, Trying Not to Try. The mind has the power to comprehend the way, but this is not enough. One needs to get beyond merely understanding the way and live it in a fully embodied manner. Cold cognition, that should say, I misspelt that, I'm afraid. Cold cognition must be made hot. Now, this is great, this phase for a body workout. We go from thinking and cognition to embodiment as a way of aligning and being fully in flow and in harmony. We're going to meet the notion of embodiment a little bit later as a trigger for flow. So thinking isn't enough here. Something about embodying a way of being, a way that is in harmony, that is effortless. From other Taoist texts, there's an interpretation of meditation as alignment between heaven and earth. On a very, very simple metaphor, if I'm meditating and my experience is of an unusual posture where my head might be forward and I might be to one side, if I'm not aligned between heaven and earth, if I'm in a posture that's working hard against gravity, that involves effort. It's more work on these muscles to keep my head in these strange contracted positions. So this definition of meditation as alignment between heaven and earth already takes us into an embodiment gesture. It's more natural. If I can balance my head, if I can find an optimal position of my torso over my hips, then sitting still requires less work from me. I begin to go to this effortless quality by simply changing my posture, changing my attitude, posture, are co-entwined here. The gesture of awareness involves gestures of alignment, in this case with the unseen force of gravity. We align within a gravitational field, and we have more possibility, more potential, simply because we're working less hard. I think that's a really nice example of how holding postures makes things work, but if we can efficiently use our body, our functioning becomes more effective. So Taoism and Zen as a route into non-doing. We're going to return a little bit to Wu Wei and the notion of virtue that emerges a little bit later. Flow states. Flow states is a more modern term. Couple of books I read, 2014 probably is when I encountered these. This one is really, really influential. Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, famously unpronounceable surname for people the people who speak English. But it's been very, very influential because he started looking at sports people and meditators, or people writing amazing essays, people losing time but producing incredible outputs. So one of the first landmark studies of what he called a flow state. And we're going to look at this book, Stephen Kotler, which kind of references the flow state work and gives it another spin, and really looking at modern sports people. So Ayrton Senna was the racing driver's racing driver. He was just a phenomenal legend as a driver, world champion, Brazilian. Suddenly, I was nearly 2 seconds faster than anybody else, including my teammate with the same car. And suddenly I realized that I was no longer driving the car consciously. I was driving it by a kind of instinct, only I was in a different dimension. I was just going and going, more and more and more and more. I was way over the limit, but still able to find even more. This zone of complete mastery, where he was the car, where he was completely in tune with the circuit, and he was enabled to do this incredible feat of driving faster than anybody had done before. Amazing version of a flow state. So I'm not going to try and pronounce the surname again. So the flow state author, what is flow? You know that what you need to do is possible to do, even though difficult. And the sense of time disappears. You forget yourself. You feel some part of something larger. Enfolded in this quote is some very interesting clues and challenges, I think, for some old models that I used to have. So he talks about a sense of time disappearing, forgetting yourself, but you feel part of something larger. You're aligned with the Tao, maybe the natural way of the world, might be that's something larger. So consistently people report that in these flow states, time is plastic. They have more time. And they also talk about the focus is on the task rather than the tools or their body. So on one level, their body also disappears in this moment of achievement. So we might think about something as simple as riding a bike. When you start to ride a bike, there's a lot of new skills to learn. You've got to move the handlebars. You've got to balance. You've got to contract your legs in a particular way. You've got to hold your foot at a particular angle. And initially, you might think about those things. You might have instructions to sit up, grip harder, move slowly. And you've got to do all of that whilst your bike is wobbling. If you think too hard about putting your foot in the right position, you don't have enough spare capacity to negotiate the balance and the motion. But there becomes a phase shift. At some stage, the learned motor patterns disappear and you achieve riding a bike without any effort. When you're riding the bike, your brain isn't really interested in which muscles contracted. It's interested in moving a leg in a way that's efficient to support you to power this gesture of riding. So absolutely, in flow states, our sense of time changes. Because we're efficiently processing the world, we don't need to pay attention to unnecessary things. We're processing things quickly, and our sense of having more time and more skill to be in our body, to fulfill our task, to do that quickly, gives us more choices about how effective we are. And we don't waste energy on little details. It's whole gestures that are learned and grooved into our experience. So this disappearing of the body and the kind of loss of time that happens in a flow state is a very, very different experience from a dissociative state. Dissociation states, our body was never really available. And it's sort of an absence and a loss of skill and a disappearing from and a separation from the world. In a flow state, yes, our body will fade into the background, but that's only because it's so grooved in and it's so reliable and so available that we know what it can do, and it's all our resources aren't checking the body, they're checking the cliff that we have to climb or the somersault that we have to do. So flow triggers things that help us achieve these incredible feats of the first people who did a double somersault instead of a single somersault, or the first people who did wingsuit gliding or slacklining, where they're going across these incredible spaces on a tightrope. We're more likely to achieve flow if there's an element of risk. It has to mean something. The high consequence drives greater focus. In a cranial context for me, the risk is the client isn't going to benefit. I take it really seriously when people are suffering and are paying me to help them suffer less. I think that's a real privilege, and it's also dangerous in some level. I'm deeply interested and engaged because I think it's important and I want to support this person. So I'm very focused in my clinic work because I don't want the risk of getting it wrong for this person. It needs to be a rich environment, lots of novelty, unpredictability and complexity add to our focus. So change and actively noticing new things, actively finding interest in the environment seems to trigger more focus, more of this flow quality. The big flow trigger, though, that I really took from the rise of Superman was this notion of deep embodiment. Yes, our time of space and body can disappear in the flow state, but that's actually founded on deep practice, a deep occupying of the body. I learn to ride the bike. I stumble, I fall over, there's risk, there's beautiful, rich environments of going down hills and going faster. But I have to practice, practice, practice. And then there's this moment, this phase shift where my body is available. And it's this tool that I don't have to focus on. I can just use the tool to achieve the outcome. But flow states, these states of effortless action, of non-doing, are all founded on, are consistently reported as states of deep embodiment, is the trigger or one of the factors that allows that. If I go back to Marina Collard and the dancing experience, she got angry, to be honest, when one of the students started talking about what you're doing is returning to a primitive state. And her response was, no, this is a deeply practiced state. I've put hours of practice and movement to find that effortless action. So it's actually a really, really skillful state. Yes, I'm not thinking and not using cognition, but I'm using instinct. But instinct is something that I've cultivated and I've learned and I've practiced, and it involves gestures and ways of being in my body that have involved hours and hours of consistent practice to achieve that moment of effortless action. So triggers for deep embodiment: risk, a novel environment, and triggers for flow, risk, a rich environment, and deep embodiment. It's the first time I met that phrase through Stephen Kotler. I really, really like it. He talks about if you want to pull the deep embodiment trigger in less extreme environments, then we simply have to learn to pay attention to all these input streams. The context here is the flow from the environment and the flow of information from our body. He says it isn't hard. Maybe this isn't hard. Zen walking, meditation teachings, and open senses, all senses awareness. This ability to pay attention to what's happening, the ability to be present, is deeply associated with this effortless action. So another author I haven't quoted here, but is Ellen Langer. She talks a lot about being mindfulness versus mindlessness. She was also around Harvard and with the flow author, Michael Csikszentmihalyi, contemporary of him, but she writes as what we're trying to achieve, or a flow state for her, is actively noticing new things, the ability to be aware, to be able to be present to what's happening inside you and inside your environment. So for her, mindlessness, not knowing what's happening, not knowing my body, not being able to pay attention to the space around me, she frames that as mindlessness. And she says that's a very inefficient state for humans. Mindfulness is this ability to actively notice new things. Let's read this quote again. Deep embodiment trigger is paying attention to all the input streams around us. Very nice. Effortless action emerges from awareness of our body and awareness of the context and space around us. Okay, I'm going to go back a little bit to Edward Slingerhand. So he talks a lot about flow states, but for him, it's not just individual achievement. He says an allied concept in Chinese philosophy is that this effortless action generates something called DE, sometimes translated as virtue, power, or charismatic power. People who have D, virtue. D is a radiance that others can detect, and it serves as an outward signal that one is in wu wei, one is in flow. D has a powerful, seemingly magical effect on those around them, allowing people in D to spread political order in an instantaneous fashion. If you have D, people like you, trust you, and are relaxed around you. So this sense of not just individual achievement from wu wei and being in harmony, but a sense of community leader and being a figure that people are drawn to, and being ethical and moral in your actions because of your ability to align with the Tao, to align with this natural, elegant order, this way that things happen most effectively. Gosh, that's pretty amazing, isn't it? We might have met those people who things happen around them, decisions seem effortless. There's a sense of clarity around purpose and a clarity for the group about what we're trying to achieve. So the Chinese philosophy version of this is morals are based on virtue, which is based on an inner sensing and inner skill to align with this natural way of doing things. This is quite different from often Western versions of morals. In the West, we use thinking quite often to create moral behavior. So we might have Enlightenment models of morals were often based on the greater good, the idea that we do least harm, but it's rational thought to calculate the greater good. Or we have Kant, who has a moral, categorical imperative. You should act as though everything you were doing was a universal law. But these Western versions of morality were based on thinking and rational thought. The Chinese model was morality emerges as by a natural alignment with the natural order of things. There's kind of a virtue. And often the Chinese text would talk about politics, which is why that quote was there for Slingerhand, quoting the old Chinese model, that politicians who have virtue and are more aligned with the Tao, make better decisions, are more charismatic, are seen as more ethical, more moral leaders. So that's quite a grand claim, isn't it, for aligning with the natural order of the world, aligning with nature, a sense of effortless action. I hope that's useful. I hope that speaks to you. Some reflections on Taoism, Zen, and Wu Wei, virtue, and then flow states with a modern twist. Extreme athletes are in this state of flow, but they only achieve their extreme state by practice, practice, practice. And then they can enter into these states where their body is so available, they don't have to think about their body, they have more time, and they can be incredibly effective in the tasks that they do. Let's look at some of these themes as applied to cranial work and the history of cranial work. Cranial work, non-doing touch is one of my favorite ways of describing cranial work at the moment. Let's look at the history, and I'll try and relate it to flow state. So osteopathy in the cranial field. Here's William Sutherland, the founder of cranial osteopathy, or cranial approaches to the mechanics and structure of the body. So Sutherland had two phases in his discovery of the work. He was initially a jigsaw, the skull as a mechanism. But he did some incredible investigations of prizing apart skulls, looking at how things fitted together and exploring how things moved. So a huge cognitive journey, a huge journey of investigating and trying to see the skull as a puzzle and realizing that the bones do move and that you can influence the movement. Initially, however, his techniques, here's Sutherland, here's a bunch of Sutherland's friends, and they're working on a skull. But this is the skull as a machine where certain things need to be fixed or cogs that need to be moved. And Sutherland would be applying force from the outside, wiggling things, moving things, with a plan in mind to achieve alignment or balance or particular shapes. Not a bad thing to do, but quite cognitive, quite full of effort, and quite intellectually led. Your bone's out of line. I think it should be in a different position. I have a plan to introduce force from the outside to invite that bone to go back to what I consider its optimum position. That was early Sutherland. And you can have some very, very rich results from working in this way. Please don't get me wrong. Sutherland underwent a transition in his later life. He begins to speak like a flow state person. He begins to speak like a Wu Wei master. He starts talking about something that he calls potency. Potency drives the subtle rhythmic motion of primary respiration. Potency is liquid light. His metaphors now weren't the body as a machine, but the body as a living, breathing organism. He came up with a motive force or a quality of rhythmic motion that he called primary respiration. And the experience of this active force of primary respiration expressed through potency or a potential, an energy to do things, he likened this to a liquid light within the body. This is very, very far away from bones and machines. He also came up with a motive or a kind of ultimate cause here, the breath of life. The breath of life, you could say, is God. He was a Christian mystic. Well, he was a Christian, Sutherland. We might substitute nature or the Tao. I want you to visualize the Tao, the breath of life, the motive force, the thing that creates life, the thing that we're trying to align with. For Sutherland, he called that the breath of life. I want you to visualize this breath of life as a fluid within this fluid, something that does not mix, something that has potency as the thing that makes it move. So this is quite esoteric language in one way. But this idea that things happen because of an internal agency and internal potency. And for Sutherland, his later writing was how to align with, how to facilitate change from within. He became much more focused on stillness and allowing things to happen rather than forcing things to happen. I think this is an amazing gesture of non-doing, Wu Wei. This is Sutherland's gravestone, be still and know. Not think hard and work out what's going on. Enter into a state of appreciation and stillness, and knowing will emerge. Right action will emerge from this appreciation and meeting in stillness. There's an amazing cranial osteopath, Roland Becker, who also talks about this territory. There is a potency within the body that is constantly working to restore the body to the base pattern of health. Potency is a term for the inherent power within the bioenergy fields in biophysiology working towards more normalization. In this worldview, there's an inherent striving for health. In cranial terms, we talk about the breath of life, primary respiration, potency, as ways of trying to explore this inherent self-organizing principle, this inherent potential for coherence and harmony. If we can somehow create the conditions where we can connect to this natural order, then this is a very efficient way of working. Becker again, in the science of health, disease, and trauma, allow the biodynamic intrinsic force, the Tao, if you like, within the body to manifest its own unerring potency, rather than using extrinsic force from without. So the language here takes a little bit of getting used to: biodynamic intrinsic forces, potency. But for me, these osteopaths, these men in suits in 1920s, 30s, 40s, 1960s America, were discovering this principle that the less you do, the more seems to happen. If I try and force a bone from the outside, then I don't get great results all the time. And infrequently, I actually set up resistance rather than change. But if we can somehow coax, allow, if we can somehow support resources within a body, the body will let go from the inside. This is an incredibly exciting moment in therapeutic work. So we are now in the territory of change as an inherent feature of human beings. We're always moving, breathing. We've always got these rhythms. We've always got this striving for order because that's a natural way of being. And somehow, if we can create the conditions to allow that to happen, then change will happen as an inherent striving to reconnect with order and coherence. I'm going to use another cranial osteopath to try and illustrate that in more detail and try and make that specific as a set of clinical gestures. So we're going to meet Jim Jealous. He died a couple of years ago. He was another osteopath in the tradition of Sutherland and Becker. So we've got three phases that Jim Jealous describes. Let me get that slide up. So here's a picture of Jim Jealous. The first phase of osteopathy, biomechanical. This is early Sutherland. In this case, the physician, the therapist, does all the work. I have a plan. I'm thinking. I need to decide what I think needs to happen. And in the osteopathy, the goal is more movement between structures. That's what we're trying to do. Our plan is often aligning things, helping things move effectively. Not a bad goal, but quite a thinking, cognitive, applying force. For me, as a chiropractor, I would run my fingers down a spine. I would decide that bones were out of line, and I'd manipulate to force that bone to go back into line according to my plan. And success was more alignment and more movement between the segments, between the joints. Jim Jealous describes a development of the model in osteopathy. He calls it functional technique. In this model, the physician does half the work. And they do this by a new technique called following the tissues to the direction of ease. So now we're getting more gentle. Now we might be holding a vertebrae or holding a bone, and instead of immediately forcing it where we think it needs to go, we're listening and gently seeing, where do you want to go? And sometimes it's like following a puppy. Sometimes bones begin to exaggerate their patterns. They begin to contract or move or express a direction of ease. This way of working is like, we're still interested in motion between segments, but we're beginning to feel that there's whole gestures. It's not just the bone moving, maybe there's a whole shape in the muscles of the back, or a whole bend that becomes apparent, or a whole shoulder gets involved as a bone in the neck moves. Following the direction of ease led to this moment of what osteopaths call a neutral, a moment where things seem to go still and take a pause. And this pause, this neutral, becomes a mythical place. So we've got bones that have been, we think, here's the spine. I hope you can see my small screen. Let me do this on the screen. We've got some bones in a spine. We think one of the bones is out of line. The first model is I'm going to come in, put a big force in, and I'm going to, boom, force that bone to back into line. Functional technique is the bone's out of line. I'm going to gently hold it, and we might follow the direction. Sometimes the pattern exaggerates, and sometimes whole shapes come through. If we follow those, we feel it exaggerates, and somehow there's a neutral, and often you'll find the bone lets go of its shape and pattern and returns to a new position. So this model of following things to a neutral and then realizing that something lets go, a point of balance tension, and then boom, things naturally reorganize, is very, very exciting, very soft way of working. But it gets even more exciting. The neutral began to fascinate osteopaths, began to fascinate people working in the cranial field. We now have biodynamic craniosacral therapy. The neutral becomes a starting point instead of an end point. We want to create this moment where things are in balance and in harmony. So now we begin to work in a way where we realize that we can allow a whole person and a whole system to feel safe, where the neutral is a sense of occupying the body in a way where I'm relaxed, I'm open, I'm present, and the shape in my spine is met as a gesture in a whole person. And the gesture is not separate from my history, from my birth patterns, from the accidents I've had, from the broken bones. All of these things are embodied at that moment in that shape. There's a whole story and a whole person. So our neutral, we approach a person and see them as someone who has stories and meanings and gestures that may be incomplete. Their spine is in a particular shape, and yes, a particular bone may be stuck, and it may be a very important element of that shape. But until we've acknowledged that there's a whole story, and until we've helped people feel safe and settle, achieve what we call, instead of a point of balance tension, which is just local and tissue orientated, but a state of balance tension where their whole of their resources is focused and all the levels and elements of that story are met, then at that neutral, which is a whole person, a whole organism event, then we get extraordinary changes. The heart changes, the breathing changes, the gut lets go, our spine uncurls, and lots of patterns let go at that moment. This is called a state of balanced awareness. Our attention as a clinician is with the detail of the structures, but also with the story, the movements, the breathing, the flow, the rhythms in a whole person. And we can't have too much of a plan. If we think we know what needs to happen, this gets in the way of this gesture of aligning with the story and the needs of the person and its inherent seeking for help. Gosh, this is hard to explain and make simple. Let me use an example of a baby. Babies' heads often get squeezed when they go through the birth canal. And sometimes we have a bone here called the temporal bone that's quite mobile. So the temporal bone might be holding a shape and some history. That might lead someone to naturally favor a position of tension in their jaw or a holding of their head. And throughout all their life, they have this little wrinkle or little pattern. Sometimes maybe that tension might lead to headaches or stories, just ways of being in the world. And maybe it doesn't, it's just a shape and a pattern in who they are. A biomechanical way of working would be I'd hold that head. I don't think that the head should be like this, and I don't think temporal bone should be twisted in this way. So I'm going to introduce force. I have a plan I analyze the position of the bone. I decide it's in an incorrect position, and I introduce forces to move that bone back into a more optimal position. Functional technique, where I have a little bit of a plan, but I follow the tissues, is I hold the bone, I have a bit of analysis, but instead of just forcing it, I allow it to express its shapes and patterns, and I realize, wow, there's a neck twist. Sometimes that goes slow. I facilitate a local balance, and wow, the pattern lets go, and we get lovely changes. I've got half a plan. I'm following the tissues. The tissues end up at the point of balanced awareness, point of balanced tension, and then boom, something changes and it comes back to a more natural organization. Biodynamics goes even further. Biodynamics goes that this shape, this pattern has many layers of storytelling. It's about birth, maybe. It's about my history of headaches. It's about this gesture of being a little tired and contracted most of the time. There may be fear bound up with that. There may be trauma and dissociation and speedy gestures bound up with that. In biodynamics, we attempt to meet the whole person. As I hold your head, I notice that you speed up or you disappear, or your breathing changes or your gut changes. Let's slowly meet that and allow you to feel safe with this gesture, this pattern, this story inside of you. We do that over time. We try and help you be safe with the intensity of the feelings. Maybe certain elements come out, maybe impressions of early memories of I can't do things, or stories about parents need to be negotiated in our therapeutic journey. But over time, we can settle, we can include the complexities without disappearing, without speeding up. And then one day, you'll skillfully notice this bone, notice this shape, it's safe, there's no trauma. Wow, I can finally let go of that pattern as a whole gesture. I shift from the inside, my breath changes, my heart changes, my gut opens. My head feels free, and there's a movement and an expansion in the whole head, the whole person. A deep, beautiful, incredible letting go from the inside. That's biodynamic craniosacral therapy. We have to start in that place of safety, that wide, deep relationship that acknowledges a whole person with all sorts of levels of stories. That may sound inefficient and time-consuming. It's absolutely not. It's the quickest way I know of working. We're getting into this territory of aligning with the Tao, aligning with an intelligence that's greater than our intellect. If we find safety, if we relate to these natural rhythms and forces, if we can pay attention in the right way, then we can facilitate these movements and directions. We can facilitate these letting goes as sort of a shedding and a sort of just this internal softening. Change in this model is about soft letting go rather than dramatic, forceful, a dramatic forcing. Wow, I hope that's useful. So biodynamic craniosacral therapy. The people we just met, Sutherland, Becker, and Jim Jealous were all osteopaths. Biodynamic craniosacral therapy includes this attempt to meet a whole person always. We're not focused on local patterns, we're focused on whole people, rhythms that are expressed in a whole person, and that rhythms are experienced and truth that emerges in relationship to another person. We find that this has a sense of harmony, and there's a sense of knowing and experience without words. We can begin to differentiate qualities of people flowing internally, and we can begin to feel this quality of alignment in someone as a set of rhythms and flows and ease in their body. I'd like to show you a quote from a client of mine. He struggled, to be honest. He described himself as nothing was gathered together. I'm a series of moments that are separate. There's no flow between moments. This really takes me back to this notion of Wu Wei as effortless, embodied coherence. The sense of, if we remember some of the quotes about the paying attention and being able to be aware of what's happening inside of me, being coherent with the environment. The dissociation, the gesture of disappearing from my body is the exact opposite of a flow state, I would offer. I'm a set of moments that are separate rather than a coherent flow where I have a stream of consciousness that feels purposeful and is engaged with the world and is safe to meet the world. So for me, biodynamics is founded on this ability to feel coherent, and is about rhythm and embodiment and flow as experiences that can be practiced, can be intuited, can be learned actually. Intuition as a learned skill. I feel coherent in myself, I feel coherent in relationship with another person. That has a tone, a texture, a quality that you learn to value. Franklyn Sills, I mentioned Franklyn earlier. We believe there's an order in human beings. There's a way that we grew and a way that we heal. Part of our notion, the expansion of cranial osteopathy, is to include embryology as a blueprint or as an underlying order. Franklyn, embryological order is with us from the moment of conception until the day we die. Our body knows how to heal. Our body knows how to connect. If we can create enough safety, enough resources, if we can come out of immediate distractions and come back to these principles of flow, connection, relationship, facilitate a reconnection to this order that is inherent in an embryo and inherent in a human being. In biodynamics, how we grow is how we heal. The embryo provides many clues to healing. How an embryo folds around the heart, how we're organized around a midline. These are equivalent to these notions of alignment between heaven and earth. There are certain phenomena that seem to suggest, that seem to be associated with this movement towards health. The study of embryology, the study of growth, the study of how we move in health, all these are things that we teach on biodynamic courses as ways of creating more efficient healing, ways that are effortless. We're not applying things from the outside. We're going to this easy state of flow where things connect naturally and things release from the inside. Very exciting, I feel. We have language for this. We talk about a state of balance. There's a woman on a tightrope. Maybe think about the gibbon we saw earlier, effortlessly walking along a tightrope. Something about balance, harmony, coherent. This is language that we use in biodynamics to articulate this state of flow. Franklyn, again, quote from 2011, the state of balance is a systemic neutral, not a locally focused neutral, not just tissues balancing in my shoulder. The whole system, the whole person, the whole organism is in a neutral state. And at that moment, we can shift out of our conditioning, out of our history, to a place of more potential. In a systemic neutral, there is a stillness that manifests throughout the system. We really value stillness as a state, this deep pause, this deep place of reconnection. We go into stillness and we come out of it differently. A little bit more language from Franklyn to complete. We talk about the notion of a gateway or stillness, this neutral, this place where the forces seem to resolve, a state of balance. Franklyn uses this notion of stillness as a mysterious gateway. In biodynamics, the state of balance is a meeting place where a new possibility can emerge. That sense of the whole of who I am has been met, and it's safe to meet that. And I don't have to do what I've always done. I can let go of some of the contractions. I can flow like water. I can breathe more easily. My heart can rest. My belly can open. My spine can let go. My limbs can find new gestures. All of that comes from that moment and appreciation of connecting with an inherent order inside of us that's not separate from the Tao, a natural order in nature. These flow states are extraordinary things to meet. A lot of resources need to be in place, a lot of skill, a lot of practice. But when you find that moment of helping a story be met and helping a body come to this place of I'm contracting so small and I meet that shape and then that's it, I meet it, I let go and I can open. It's an extraordinarily beautiful thing. And it's an effortless thing. The work you do is to bring skill and awareness that this is possible, not an endless thinking and trying to work it out, more a coming into stillness, a meeting of rhythm, synchronizing with those rhythms and allowing things to shift gear from the inside. Good, I hope. I'm going to take a pause now. Is flow state the fluid tide? Flow state's a much bigger thing than just a fluid tide. So the rhythms are really rich for us in craniosacral therapy. The ability to feel rhythm and interact with rhythm is one of the core skills. But rhythms that are more elegant, playing better tunes, are more in harmony, that tends to suggest health. Rhythms that are discordant, things are pulling in different directions, often quite random or not working together, that's disease, ill health. So a fluid tide is a language for us that we feel fluid movements, often organized around a midline and a sense of fluid flowing up around the dural sac into the brain and leaving the brain, a fluid tide. So a fluid tide is a form of flow state, but a flow state is the biggest state to describe elegance, harmony, coordination, where things are working without effort and are more aligned with the natural order of things. Can biodynamic craniosacral therapy be used alongside a regular practice of TRE? Yes. What's the link between TRE and craniosacral therapy? Biodynamics is a trust in rhythm. In biodynamics, it's a relational process where the therapist is skilled at feeling slow rhythms in a human being. And we guide, facilitate, orient towards this neutral, this sort of uncoupling from condition, reorienting to a natural order. But we feel that as slower rhythms, maybe a slow state of stillness, and in that rhythmic and interacting with rhythm, more elegance, more harmony emerges. Cranial work is quick rhythms. TRE is quick rhythms, much quicker than the slower cranial rhythms, but it's still an ability to find rhythm, coherence, and facilitating that. So I love that bridge between craniosacral therapy and TRE, tension and trauma releasing exercises of rhythm. And in TRE, we also have a trust. We trust the shaking, trust the tremors is a TRE phrase. Let the inherent seeking, your body's not as smart, your intellect isn't as smart as the body. Let the body shake. And in that communication that happens from natural shaking in TRE, we find that things reorganize from within in a very similar way to cranial work. TRE quick rhythms, trust the tremors to do the work. TRE, trust the tide, slower rhythms, and the rhythms are facilitated by touch and relationship. I think those are nice bridges between TRE and biodynamic craniosacral therapy. Can biodynamics be used for some patients who are on psychiatric medication? Yes, absolutely. Whatever the force is, whatever the things that that person is holding, they will benefit from de-stressing, from learning to breathe, learning to feel, learning to align to these principles of flow and coherence. Human beings are extraordinarily adaptive. One of the things about biodynamics is this focus on the water flows and water adapts. Humans adapt. We're living, breathing, growing, adaptable organisms. We're not fixed machines. Our feature is adaptability. Sometimes those adaptations are hard. Sometimes there is psychosis and sometimes we have very poor health, but we can always find more ease within the conditions that with the conditions that we have. So whether we are taking lots of medications, whether we are struggling with really severe diseases, somehow there's a more optimum way of responding to that. Somehow there's ways of meeting that where it's less of a struggle and more about achieving flow. Even though it's not what we used to do, there's still an ability to optimize our resources. And I would say the breath of life, the Tao, can easily encompass medication and use that as a force for good rather than a resistance that limits us. It's something that helps us. And if we conceive of it in that way, that makes a big difference. Steve Williams, I personally think biodynamics goes extremely well with somatic experiencing training. I'm very interested in complex PTSD as it explains a great deal of human being suffering. Any thoughts? Yeah, I've not trained in SE, but I've been around a lot of people who've done SE. I think SE is a reverence for the body and an attempt to include the body in the therapeutic process. It does that, as I understand it, through talking and helping people in relationship be more skillful at feeling body states. So I think the journey really is to align to a body, to help the self-healing mechanisms as expressed through the vagus, or the self-healing capabilities as expressed through gestures of agency and action. Somatic experiencing facilitators really harness that ability for a body to reorganize and use some of the features of the autonomic nervous system. They skillfully relate to those. They help people feel safe. They let people let go of tight diaphragms. They help people meet intense sensations. They help people pay attention to sensations with a way of transforming sensations. All of that is absolutely in line with biodynamic craniosacral therapy. Somatic experiencing people don't use that much touch. They use maybe verbal interaction and presence as a way of facilitating that sense of change. In biodynamic craniosacral therapy, we use touch as our main tool. We use presence, touch, some verbal skills as a way of regulating an autonomic nervous system, of a way of helping people feel safe. But very much, I think, I like to call biodynamic craniosacral therapy a silent psychotherapy. The body's talking, it's talking in different rhythms, it's talking in shapes and patterns. We learn to listen to them, not judge them. We learn to try and remind the body of its natural order, its embryological order, its its phenomena of rhythm, tide, midline that seem to express health more clearly. But there's always a deep reverence for the body, I think, in craniosacral therapy, and a deep reverence for the body, actually, I think, in somatic experiencing, and a trust that change will emerge from within. So I see a lot of parallels between trauma, good trauma models that are about embodiment, and craniosacral therapy. Questions about training. So craniosacral therapy, biodynamic craniosacral therapy, 2-year training, currently running courses in London, Galway, and joyously, actually, we're hoping to reboot a course in Ukraine. That course started, kind of collapsed because of the war, obviously. But Maxim, the main facilitator there, has really kept the group together. So we might be trying to reboot that course in January 2023. So Body College, running courses, Ukraine, hopefully, and then Galway and London. 2-year trainings, 10 5-day seminars. We teach you these skills of meditative awareness, of how to feel rhythm, and how to let the rhythms reorganize from within without too much planning and thinking from you. We give you lots of teachable skills about developing intuition. For me, intuition is paying attention to the messages from your body and skillfully responding to those messages from your body, and then including another person's body and skillfully responding to the messages from their body. Intuition is not magic, folks. Intuition is a learned skill that we can teach, a learned skill and a teachable skill. You pay attention to phenomena of elegance, order, reorganization, of the Tao, how it flows, of the breath of life, of primary respiration, how potency manifests. We think we can do that for you within 2 years. So not forcing things, wiggling things, pushing things. We give you extraordinary amount of anatomy. You can have a real precision in your awareness, but the main skill is to notice something, keep noticing, and relate to the tide, relate to health, noticing that you want things to happen. You'll always want things to happen, but being really soft in your attachments and keep offering what's possible here, what can be new here, what can change in this moment. It's really hard to consistently offer that, but we believe we can teach you how to learn, be more intuitive, how to learn to honor the gestures and movements of a body, and how to follow rather than lead in people into these flow states. So yes, courses starting in Galway in a couple of weeks, in the start of October, and a course starting in London in late October. All the details, bodycollege.net /London for London /Galway for Galway. I'm actually going to put the old Ukraine page up again because we're very excited about that happening. And hopefully courses up north in England would be the next stage, probably 2023. I'm going to try for a course up in the north of England. There's lots of details about the training progress on bodycollege.net. So go and have a look at that if you are at all interested in training. Great. Okay, I think I'm going to complete right now. Thanks for paying attention. I'll send out the link to a recording. I'll give the recording as a podcast. Thanks for listening, folks. I hope you can find your flow states, those effortless moments of non-doing, and realize that these are precious. Bodies are a big part of that. These things don't just happen. It takes practice to be intuitive. It takes practice to trust your body. But being more ethical, being someone who are trusted by other people, being incredibly skillful in supporting people to change, these are worthy goals. And those moments where I feel or I achieve those effortless relationships with my clients are incredibly valuable to me, incredibly exciting for me. So yeah, thank you for listening and good luck.